President Trump is convening a White House meeting of his top national security officials to discuss the next steps regarding Venezuela.
In the last few months, the tension in Venezuela has intensified, with the United States demonstrating all its strength in the Caribbean Sea in an unprecedented way. The last time Washington concentrated so many means in that region was when George H.W. Bush ordered the Panama invasion in 1989 to overthrow and arrest the dictator Manuel Noriega, accused of leading a drug trafficking cartel. Air Force, naval and amphibious, composed of more than a dozen warships, dozens of hunts, and the attack group of one nuclear aircraft carrier, concentrate there in a clear demonstration of brute force and power. The official narrative of the White House points out that the main objective of this movement is to combat drug trafficking, a serious social and public health problem for the United States, and that, according to Washington, has its origin in Colombia and Venezuela. But it is already very evident that the issue is not only about drug trafficking. After all, who needs a nuclear aircraft carrier and submarines to chase boats through the Caribbean? In the backstage, and with direct words from President Donald Trump himself, the true goal seems to be to overthrow the regime of Nicolas Maduro, who the United States accuses of being the leader of the Cartel de los Soles and a usurper of the presidency after fraudulent elections in 2024. But despite the mobilization of this gigantic military force, Trump seems to be postponing his decision to attack. And this hesitation has generated a series of speculations. For some, it is a pressure strategy to try to convince Maduro to voluntarily abandon the country. But others see it as a sign of weakness and hesitation, a sign that Trump does not want to make such a difficult decision. The idea that Trump is bluffing, as Maduro has already publicly stated, gained strength in recent weeks, with the Venezuelan dictator in his speeches and appearances showing increasing confidence. And in one of his famous videos, Maduro appears dancing to the sound of songs that, ironically, that antagonize Trump's lack of action. Not only by fiddling with the American threats, but also by showing him completely carefree with the military movements in the Caribbean. And for Maduro's regime, this rhetoric has been effective, with him being able to consolidate the support of a large part of the population, which sees these attacks as an imperialist aggression and an attempt by the United States to interfere in Venezuela's internal affairs, aiming not only to restore democracy, but mainly to control the largest oil reserves on the planet. But what is really happening backstage, and why Trump does not act immediately to overthrow Maduro? Some analysts point out that despite the enormous concentration of military power, a direct attack with missiles, bombings, or any other type of air action would not be enough to overthrow Maduro, and that this would only serve to reinforce the propaganda of the Chavez regime, and as an excuse for Maduro to further increase the measures of persecution and internal repression against the population. According to these analysts, without an earthquake invasion, the American forces can cause widespread destruction, but would hardly achieve a change of the royal regime. Maduro, supported by a military and political structure that gives him total support, could easily present these American attacks as an imperialist aggression, reinforcing his usual narrative, and more than that, he could use these attacks to galvanize his popular support, folding his resistance propaganda against an aggressor. The fact that Trump is postponing a direct military intervention suggests that he recognizes the risk of a prolonged war, and that an isolated air attack could, in fact, further strengthen Maduro's position, giving the dictator more capital to justify his permanence in power. This argument is quite valid, and in fact, when we analyze the history of attacks against dictatorships, we conclude that mere air attacks rarely result in the fall of dictatorships, as was very evident in the attacks against Libya by Muammar Gaddafi. For several times over decades, the West carried out heavy airstrikes against Libya, trying to weaken Gaddafi's dictatorship. But what they achieved was just the opposite, with the Libyan dictator entrenching himself even more in power, with its fall only occurring after internal conflicts that had no relation with the various airstrikes carried out in the past. The same happened recently in Syria with the dictator Bashar al-Assad, who for almost 20 years faced constant aerial attacks from Israel, falling from power only after an offensive of internal armed groups in the context of the civil war that has been invading the country since 2011. These and other examples show that only bombs and missiles launched from the skies are not enough to overthrow dictators strongly entrenched in power, as is the case of Nicolas Maduro, who has armed all Venezuelan institutions, from the justice to the armed forces, which means that Trump, obviously, as a Pentagon advisor, he knows that the only way to have any real hope of defeating Maduro is through an invasion. But if Trump decides to invade Venezuela with an earth operation, he will be committing to an open conflict with inevitable American casualties. And this would be an extremely risky scenario, both in military terms and political terms, especially now when we see that the elections in the middle of the mandate are approaching, and it's a time when Trump's approval is falling hard. In this scenario, with young American soldiers dying in Venezuela, or with the country slowly diving into a new long and stressful war, this time in the Venezuelan Amazon forest, the situation could harm the elections in the middle of the term and lead to the loss of Republican control over Congress and the Senate. The history of the American intervention in the Middle East has already made clear the costs of a prolonged war. It is an obvious fact that Venezuela is militarily unable to prevent American landings, and even the American conquest of infrastructure and cities won. But the Chavista dictatorship is so impregnated in so many spheres in Venezuela that it is possible to foresee a scenario of guerrilla and attacks within cities aiming to spread chaos and prevent the consolidation of a new transitional government. If this scenario becomes true, Trump can dive into a long war that will certainly not please the American voters at all. Therefore, all this hesitation of Trump can be linked to a strategy much more calculated than it seems at first sight. And instead of an earthquake invasion, the focus can be on wear out the Maduro regime through economic pressure, diplomatic, and, who knows, even through indirect actions, without the United States committing directly to a war. And while the decision is not taken, Maduro follows his rhetoric, consolidating himself more and more as the leader of a terrible dictatorship. And every day that passes without action can be another day of favorable propaganda to him. And this puts Trump in a more and more difficult position. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any news. Thank you.